du meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe.
On June 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler unleashed the largest military invasion in history. Operation Barbarossa, Germany's assault on the Soviet Union. What began with stunning success as German tanks roared across the steppes and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies would ultimately unravel into a disaster that shifted the entire course of the Second World War. At first, it looked as though Germany might achieve another lightning-fast victory. Vast Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers perished or were captured. Moscow seemed almost within grasp, yet the campaign faltered just short of its objective, and in December 1941, the Red Army counterattacked, driving the Germans back from the gates of the Soviet capital. How could a campaign that promised so much collapse so spectacularly? To understand Barbarossa's failure, we must trace its planning, execution, and the factors that turned Germany's greatest gamble into Hitler's first land defeat. The origins of Barbarossa. Hitler's intention to invade the Soviet Union was no sudden whim. As early as July 1940, even before the Battle of Britain had ended, plans were already forming. In truth, the seeds were planted much earlier. In Mein Kampf, written in the 1920s, Hitler declared his belief that Germany's destiny lay in conquering Lebensraum, living space, across Eastern Europe. For him, the Soviet Union was the ultimate prize. Fertile land, immense resources, and the destruction of the communist system he despised. Germany's lightning conquest of France in 1940 only reinforced Hitler's confidence. If the supposedly formidable French army had crumbled in just 6 weeks, surely the weak Soviets would collapse just as quickly. Hitler famously quipped that all we have to do is kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. The plan envisioned a rapid, decisive campaign lasting 6 to 8 weeks. Blitzkrieg tactics, combining fast-moving armored spearheads with overwhelming air power, had worked brilliantly in Poland and France. Hitler believed they would work again. The catch was that Germany lacked the manpower and resources for a prolonged war of attrition. A quick victory was not just preferable, it was essential. The invasion force. Germany assembled over 3 million soldiers, the largest invasion force in history, and divided them into 3 massive army groups. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad, Army Group Center aimed at Moscow, and Army Group South pushed into Ukraine. This 3-pronged assault was intended to crush Soviet forces at the border, capture critical cities, and end the campaign quickly before winter set in. True to the Blitzkrieg doctrine, the strategy focused not on prolonged battles, but on bypassing defenses, striking deep, and breaking the enemy's will to resist. Phase 1. Lightning success. At dawn on June 22, 1941, German forces struck without warning. The results were devastating. The Luftwaffe destroyed much of the Soviet Air Force on the ground in the opening days, giving Germany air supremacy. Panzer divisions surged deep into Soviet territory, cutting off and surrounding vast numbers of enemy troops. The Red Army was caught utterly unprepared. The new frontier in Poland had not been properly fortified, and Stalin's purges of the officer corps in the 1930s left the Soviet military badly led and disorganized. Unlike the French and British in 1940, who often withdrew before encirclement, Soviet units were too slow or poorly commanded to escape. Entire armies were trapped. By the end of summer, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers had been killed or captured. It seemed the German timetable was working perfectly. Yet cracks were already appearing beneath the surface. The fatal pause. German planners had assumed that once the frontier armies were destroyed, the road to Moscow would be wide open. Instead, they discovered that the Soviet Union's resources were far larger than expected. By Christmas 1941, despite losing 3 million soldiers, the Red Army was still fighting. The further the panzers advanced, the more stretched their supply lines became. Soviet units trapped behind the lines launched raids on German communications, disrupting fuel and ammunition deliveries. Rather than pressing directly onto Moscow, Hitler ordered Army Group Center to halt and divert resources to clear up lingering Soviet resistance. German generals protested bitterly, but Hitler was adamant. This pause allowed the Soviets precious time to dig in, reinforce their defenses, and prepare new defensive lines before Moscow. What should have been a final sprint became a grinding struggle. Phase 2. Resistance hardens. When the Germans resumed their offensive in the autumn of 1941, they faced new obstacles. The Soviets, though still poorly equipped, had been reinforced with supplies arriving from Britain via Arctic convoys. Divisions were hastily raised, sometimes without proper uniforms or enough rifles, but they were sufficient to plug gaps in the line. Even more critically, entire factories had been relocated eastward to the Ural Mountains, beyond German reach. Production of tanks, especially the revolutionary T-34, was ramping up. The Red Army now had modern, effective weapons to deploy against the invaders. Then came the greatest enemy of all, the Russian climate. October brought the dreaded Rasputitsa, the season of mud. Roads turned into quagmires, immobilizing tanks and trucks. Progress slowed to a crawl. Just as the Germans neared Moscow, winter arrived in full force. Temperatures plummeted, and troops were woefully unprepared. Many lacked proper winter uniforms, and weapons froze in the sub-zero cold. By November, more German soldiers were hospitalized for frostbite than for battle wounds. Despite reaching within 20 kilometers of Moscow, the German offensive sputtered to a halt. The Wehrmacht, built for short, decisive campaigns, had run headlong into a war of endurance it could not win. The Soviet counterattack. Yet the Germans still believed they held the upper hand. Leningrad was under siege, Kiev had fallen, and Moscow appeared cornered. They anticipated finishing the job in the spring of 1942. But Stalin had a surprise. Intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack the Soviet Far East. This allowed the transfer of experienced, well-equipped divisions from Siberia. These troops were hardened for winter warfare, clad in white camouflage and equipped with weapons designed for the cold. On December 6, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counter-offensive outside Moscow. The exhausted, frozen Germans were taken completely by surprise. Soviet forces pushed them back, marking the first time Hitler's armies had been forced onto the defensive. Barbarossa had ended, not with the capture of Moscow, but with German troops retreating in disarray. Why Barbarossa failed? Operation Barbarossa collapsed because of a mixture of ideological arrogance, logistical weakness, and Soviet resilience. Hitler's belief that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure fatally underestimated both its manpower and its industrial capacity. Germany had gambled on a short war it could not afford to lose. Instead, the Soviets transformed the conflict into a war of attrition, precisely the kind of struggle Germany could not sustain. With factories relocated beyond reach, new tanks like the T-34 rolling off production lines, and Allied aid beginning to flow, the Soviet Union had the resources to keep fighting indefinitely. The weather compounded these problems, but the root issue was strategic overconfidence. The pause to destroy Soviet pockets delayed the drive on Moscow long enough for the Red Army to regroup. Once winter set in, the dream of a quick victory was over. The aftermath. Despite the failure of Barbarossa, Hitler refused to abandon his goals. In 1942, he launched a new offensive, this time aimed at the oil-rich Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. His generals urged another push for Moscow, but Hitler had realized, belatedly, that this was a war of resources as much as territory. Oil was vital to keep the Wehrmacht moving. Yet by then, the illusion of easy conquest was gone. The German army was bleeding men and equipment it could not replace at the pace the Soviets could. The Eastern Front had become a brutal war of attrition, one in which Germany's initial superiority could not be maintained. Barbarossa was not just a failed operation, It was the turning point that ensured Germany would eventually lose the war. The Soviet Union had survived the onslaught, and in surviving, it had transformed the conflict into one Germany could never hope to win. And that brings us to the end of the story of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's greatest gamble and his first great defeat. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history and want to see more content just like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our future uploads. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.